Well, let's turn to a quickly update on the current law and guidance for places of worship. And I want to say that this relates to the situation in England, particularly because the new tier system has been introduced, was voted in by a majority of Parliament, a significant majority yesterday. I'm conscious that the exact rules are different in England and Wales, although some of the things I'm going to be saying about, for example, singing, are relevant to all different parts of the UK. So it's an update on the law and guidance, particularly in relation to England. And this has been a significant week in relation to the law and guidance. And I should say, if you want to ask questions, please do send your questions on the chat to Phil Topham and he'll curate them. But it's been a significant week on law and guidance because yesterday the government guidance for places of worship was updated. So new guidance for places of worship to take account of the new rules. Government has published principles for safer singing, which are relevant for churches. There's updated guidance for performing arts, which is also relevant for churches in relation to singing and carol events. And the new health protection coronavirus restrictions for the tiers in England have been published and implemented following Parliament's vote yesterday. All of these key pieces of government documents are available now online. The references are here and we'll make those available to you so you can read the original sources. What I'm trying to do here is summarize them in as far as they apply to churches and church ministry. The regulations this time around, it's a 70-page document, so it's huge. So what I'm trying to do is distill out what are the main principles that I think are relevant to churches and church leaders. Some of this you'll know and we can skip over quickly. Some of it I hope it will be helpful to bring to your attention. Firstly, the law on gatherings. As we now know, places of worship are open. Effectively, churches that gather together for public worship, that is a gathering. The rules on indoor gatherings in the different tiers, the key thing here is the groups that you can be in when you come to a gathering. So you can come to a church and there'll be more than 6 people present, but you're meant to remain in a group. And in groups of tier 1, the basic rule is you've got to remain in a group of a maximum of 6 people. That's the group that you can be with. If you're in tier 2 or tier 3 in an indoor gathering in church, you've got to be only in a group that's made up of your household, which also includes your extended household if you've got a support bubble. So those are the rules for indoor gatherings, slightly different for outdoor gatherings. And it's important we note this because of the rules about sort of singing and possible carol events. If it's an outdoor gathering, for tier 1, it's still 6 people in a maximum in a group. For tier 2, it's any 6 people, not just a household outside. So it's a broader group for tier 2. For tier 3, it's the same. Even if it's outside, in tier 3, you can only gather in a household group. Now, here's the important point. These rules about gatherings are not simply guidance. This is a matter of law. So it's against the law to sort of mix between groups or to mingle between groups. So in other words, if you come to church in a group of 6 people, you can't choose to join another group of 6 and swap groups while you're there. And similarly, there should be no mingling, no social interaction between the groups that are present. So it's against the law to mix and to mingle, and there are various levels of fines that apply in relation to mixing and mingling. And also, of course, you're meant to maintain social distancing. Social distancing is guidance rather than law, but the social distancing is that you should maintain 2 meters distance or 1 meter with mitigation. So those are the rules on gathering. That'll be whether your church is meeting in the church building or outside. Secondly, just something about traveling between tiers. This is an issue that's been raised. The challenge here is that for some churches, if, for example, you're a church in a tier 3 area, but people come to you from tier 2 areas, what are the rules, what are the guidance that relate to that? So here, 2 things that are important. Firstly, it's the law that if you travel to a lower tier from a higher tier, you still have to keep the law yourself that applies to the tier where you live. So in other words, even if you go into a lower tier, the law that governs your behavior who you can gather with is the tier level where you live. So you can't, for example, go from tier 3 to tier 2 and then mix with 6 people outside. You've still only got to mix with your household group. So there are challenges where church congregations span different tiers. And secondly, in relation to travel between tiers, there's no fixed law that says you can't, but the guidance is to avoid travel into tier 3 areas unless it's necessary. Now, you may well argue that coming to church is necessary, but it's at least worth bearing in mind that the guidance is that you shouldn't travel into a tier 3 area from a lower area unless it's necessary. Now, what are the implications of these rules for churches and what we do? So just to summarize, again, I hope you know this already. Firstly, it means churches are open for public worship. You can use your church building for public worship. You can also use your church building for study groups and prayer groups, but you must remain in the groups of 6 or household groups, and there mustn't be interaction between those groups. So you can, for example, discuss and pray within the group. You can't discuss and pray across groups. That would clearly be mingling. You can still have support groups up to 15 people meeting in church. So for those who need particular support because of an issue or a life stage. You can have weddings that are held with up to 15 people attending, funerals up to 30, and the numbers exclude those who are working. You can also hold organized parent and child groups with up to 15 people attending. And in that 15 limit, children under 5 are not included. So up to 15 people excluding the children under 5. And it's emphasized, and this is really important for church leaders, that venue managers, that's the people who control the space, should ensure that social distancing is maintained. We'll come back to that. Well, what about the implications for singing? Well, this is the area where it was unclear whether there might be a change in the guidance on singing. There has been, but it's not a change that allows congregational singing in the way that we would like. So to summarize the position in relation to singing, firstly, in relation to singing indoors, the guidance is clear. Congregations should not participate in any activity that can create aerosols, including singing, shouting, and chanting. The government has said this is justified by scientific evidence, and it's the advice of Public Health England. So the guidance is you should not sing as a congregation indoors. However, the guidance has been slightly relaxed in that you can have choirs performing indoors. So even though you can't have congregational singing, you can have a choir performing indoors. But a couple of elements that are relevant to that. The choir must comply with the rules on gathering and groups. So for example, if you've got more than 6 people in the choir, you've got to have separate groups that don't mingle and mix. And you should maintain social distancing within the choir. So you can have a choir, but it's got to comply with the rules about groups, and it should observe social distancing. And the other element that the guidance particularly emphasizes is that you should ensure that there's a gap of at least 2 meters if you've got a choir between the performers and the first row of worshippers. So that's the position in relation to singing indoors, not the congregation, but you can have a choir provided that you maintain social distancing. What about singing outdoors? Well, this is the area where the guidance has changed and is significant for churches. Again, you can have choirs performing outdoors. Again, they have to comply with the requirements about groups and social distancing. But importantly here, the congregation can sing outside. But here, the guidance is that the congregation can sing outside, but it should be preferably seated. Again, that's a guidance, not a rule, but it should be preferably seated and 2 meter social distancing maintained at all times. So within the outside gathering, 2 meter social distancing should be maintained between all those who are taking part. That means to say that from a church perspective, you can gather outside in the grounds of a place of worship. So if you've got a church with a car park or a garden, you can meet to have outdoor singing in that space. but the total capacity has got to be determined by social distancing and how many people you can fit in. You can gather in other places, like public open places, but where that is the case, you should liaise with the person responsible for the public open place. And if you're thinking of having a large gathering, the advice is you should speak to the local authority. They need to be satisfied that you are putting in place the appropriate health and safety measures. So if you want to use a public space and you want to have a large event, speak to the appropriate authorities in order to gain permission. And here's the crucial thing, particularly for church leaders: you must undertake a risk assessment that considers the security of the event. So outdoor events are more vulnerable to security issues, but also obviously social distancing and COVID risk, and particular attention on managing the arrival and departure of people so that social distancing is maintained all the time. So the good news is you can sing outdoors as a congregation, but you need to observe the social distancing requirements and get the appropriate permissions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of leaders' liability, because I think this is crucially important. It is the case that the position on singing is guidance and not law. In other words, if a congregation member sings in the church, they don't commit a criminal offence and they can't be fined for it. But it's very easy for people to say, well, if it's just guidance, then we can choose to ignore that guidance and we can sing because we think it's the right thing to do. Even though it's not against the law to sing, there are liabilities for church leaders that are crucially important. The crucial element of the kind of the new regulations is actually paragraph 7, which I've put up here for you, which basically, if you are an organizer of an event, which will include the trustees or elders of a church, you're the gathering organizer, then you have some legal obligations. You have the obligation to carry out a risk assessment. In carrying out that risk assessment, you have a legal obligation to take all reasonable measures to limit the risk of transmission. And all reasonable measures requires you to take account of any guidance issued by the government. I think in practice, it would be impossible to say that you've taken all reasonable measures if you ignore the clear guidance of the government about the dangers of singing and the needs for social distancing in relation to singing. So although it's only guidance, as the organisers of the event, as the church trustees, you have a legal obligation to observe health and safety rules and to take into account all the guidance that's issued. I think it would be quite difficult to argue that that guidance can be set aside and you can simply choose to sing. So what are the implications, therefore, for church leaders? Well, it seems to me that even though singing is not against the law, if you as church leaders organise an event at which there is singing against the guidance, very likely you commit an offence against the health and safety guidance. You have a responsibility to ensure the event is safe. That involves observing, I think, the guidance on singing and social distancing. Secondly, and this is really important, something that follows from that is there may well be an issue of insurance cover if you fail to meet your duties under the health and safety legislation. So if you fail to fulfill your health and safety responsibility, it seems to me that many insurers may therefore choose not to insure you for the event that you hold. And you can get some help from FIEC on the health and safety position. We published a new winter risk assessment of you just a week ago, but that is the legal responsibility that church leaders have to undertake. So it's simply not as simple as saying singing is a matter of guidance. We can choose to sing and we can avoid the social distancing. Basically, it falls within the health and safety legislation. Finally, just to say, as we sum up all of this, I think it's worth saying that although it's restrictive and it's not necessarily what we want, there are significant opportunities for churches that we can exploit. So, for example, we can't hold carol services with singing in the same way, but we are able, for example, to hold more effective carol concert events with a good choir, with performed carols sung from the front, with good music. We can make the most of the opportunity, and maybe we could have carol concert events rather than carol service events. We may well be able to hold outdoor carol services at which people can come and sing, although bear in mind there the need to maintain social distancing, the risk assessment issues. You've got to be able to steward the event well to enable that to happen. We're able to sing door-to-door carol singing. So you can go door-to-door singing in a group of 6, again, maintaining social distancing. There might be opportunities for organising perhaps more informal street and community carol singing, getting people together in your street or your neighbourhood to be able to sing carols might be an option. Again, observing the kind of principles about social distancing. Churches might be able to organise a hybrid service. For example, if they've got a garden or a car park, you might be able to have a hybrid service at which you do some congregational singing outside, then come into the building for a talk or for elements in the building, and then go out again. So you can combine some outside singing with some inside service elements if you've got the facilities to be able to do that. Can I lastly say, although we obviously our focus is on services and outdoor carol services, let's remember that for many people, they still won't come to church. They're advised not to come to church. Non-Christians may not come to church, and therefore, I still think there's a huge amount of benefit in high quality online events for Christmas. We shouldn't put all of our eggs in the carol service, physical or outdoor service basket. If we want to reach the maximum number of people, we might want to remember the vital importance of online offerings. So I hope that gives you an overview of what the guidance is, what your responsibilities are as church leaders, and it gives you some ideas for opportunities and how you might be able to make the most of what is now available.
Okay, thanks, John. Let's go and try and do these quick fire then, shall we? We've got quite a few coming in. Thank you for your questions. I have answered some of you on the chat, questions I knew the answer to. So if you've sent me a question privately, do check if I've replied to you, if it doesn't get asked here, because some of them even I was able to answer, which is wonderful. John, is mingling allowed in an outdoor public place if a service takes place in an outdoor public place?
No, mingling and mixing is to do with the groups you can be in outside. So it makes no difference whether it's indoors or outdoors. You are only to be in the group and you are not to mingle with others. So it's basically the same as it was before the lockdown. So we mustn't think that outdoors gives you the entitlement to mingle between groups. If you're in a tier 3 area, you can only essentially mingle with the people in your household who are in your group. If you're in a tier 2 area, you can mingle with 6 people in a group. They don't have to be from your household. But no, the rule about mingling and mixing between groups is irrespective of indoor or outdoor. That's the basic law that prevents social interaction in order to reduce the spread of the virus.
Thanks, John. Moving on to the kind of singing guidelines.
So if I just caveat, let me just caveat that. Of course, when you're in a group outside, there's the special dispensation over the Christmas period, which enables you to gather with people from 3 households. So you can have a bigger group over the Christmas period. But again, it's only mingling within that fixed 3-house group that you've established.
Thanks, John. Just thinking about the singing guidelines, what do we do with some of the subjective things that are in those guidelines? Things like phrases like think about carefully, limit the duration of singing. Have you got any advice for churches on what that might look like?
That's got to be the judgment that you make in relation to health and safety issues. It seems to me that they're not laying down rules there. At one level, I suspect for many of us as churches, we will probably have carol services, carol concerts that are relatively short, would be my guess. I would imagine that lots of churches, it would be less than an hour. It wouldn't be an hour of continuous singing anyway. There'd be a variety of different things in the course of that event. That seems to me to be falling within the ambit of what is a limited amount of singing over the period of time. I think they're against very long extended periods of continuous singing. Obviously outdoors, I would suspect that our services will be even shorter and tighter. So you've just got to think through what you're doing and whether it's genuinely reasonable as a way of trying to prevent the spread of the virus. The most important thing is maintaining the social distancing. That's the key element that protects people.
John, one of the things that was allowed previously was singing in kind of children's settings. So amongst children's groups, singing was allowed. Questions come in here specifically about carol services for children, whether they would be allowed to do singing if there were parents in that service as well, Would the rule of 15 apply to those over the age of 5 if parents and children were together? Would it be normal service guidelines and therefore singing wouldn't be allowed? Can you give any thoughts on those issues particularly?
I'm not sure about the exact answer to that. I don't think that you can, I mean, a children's activity group for up to 15 people is not the same as a carol service. I think as soon as you've got adults present, generally speaking, you need to observe the general requirements for singing. We can look into that and confirm that, but that would be my sort of initial response there. I mean, obviously, if you've got only children together in a children's church context, you may well be able to sing, but it's particularly protecting adults that the current regime is designed to achieve.
Any guidance, John, if you're holding a carol service in person or outside, with how many folk you should get up to the front to sort of read and do different elements of the service? Is there anything kind of sensible that we could think about there?
There's no limit on that. Again, the specifics are really protecting everybody in the group in relation to social distancing. So the exact numbers, the total number of people in the space has got to be determined by social distancing. You've got to work through, if you're getting people up to the front, is it possible for them to go up to the front whilst maintaining a 2-meter distance from everyone? So there are things you've got to bear in mind. The overriding criteria is the maintaining of social distancing at all times, is the way that the guidance puts it. So I don't think it's about the total number of people. After all, if you've got congregational singing outside, in the end, everybody present is speaking one way or another. So it's the social distancing that becomes the primary protection that's operating in that context.
John, is a socially distanced band allowed in tier 2? And similarly, could they sing in the same way as a socially distanced choir could?
I don't see why that's a problem. You can already have musicians who are supporting services in church, supporting recordings. They can sing. Again, the key thing is that they maintain suitable social distancing, both from one another, depending on the size of the band, and from the people that they're singing towards.
Can rehearsals happen in tier 3 ahead of carol services?
I think so. I can't be definitive, but I think that that is a possibility, yeah. But you'd have to look at the performing arts guidance. The performing arts guidance certainly allows rehearsals for choirs to take place. I would therefore imagine that that is within the performing arts guidance that the public worship or the places of worship guidance refers you to.
John, in terms of the tier 3 restrictions and the rule of 6, someone's just asking for clarification here. 6 people can meet in outdoor spaces such as parks, beaches or countryside in tier 3. That's right, isn't it? But it's not quite the same in a church setting. Can you just clarify that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some rule, and actually the places of worship guidance doesn't draw attention to this. There is some ability to meet more people in specific public places, but that clearly doesn't apply to anything like church services, church gatherings, church carol events. They wouldn't fall within that context. That would be a church event to which the rules would apply.
John, do you have any steer on whether support groups have worked for people wearing masks and up to 15 in a church? Have you seen how that's been working for churches at all?
Well, churches have done support groups. The key thing with support groups, it needs to be within the categories that are recognised for support. So those are generally things like addictions that people are suffering with, life stage issues like new parents, NCT groups, bereavement groups, people struggling with issues of sexuality is included within the legislation. So where churches are ministering to people who have got vulnerabilities and addictions, sort of support groups have very much been a lifeline for the churches to be able to serve in that way. Again, I think we've said over the months that the ordinary church meetings of prayer meetings and Bible studies don't really fall into the category of support groups. Although if people in church are suffering, say, from anxiety, panic attacks, issues created by the lockdown, then support groups that are there to help people with a particular sort of mental health issue, vulnerability, that can fall within the scope of a support group. But just your ordinary Bible study groups are highly unlikely to fall within that category. In fact, Bible study groups are differentiated within the places of worship guidance from support groups. So they're clearly not viewed by the government as the same thing.
John, last one for you. A lot of churches clearly do Christmas meals, that kind of thing, community meals at this time of year, particularly in the run up to Christmas. Can that kind of hospitality take place this year? And if so, what might it look like?
Again, I'm not entirely sure of all the answers on that. Obviously, there are issues about the serving of food. I think you can deliver food to people in their homes and do ministries like that. I think gathering together people for a meal for an event is probably outside of the scope of what the guidance enables you to do, particularly in tier 2 and tier 3. Tier 3 in particular, you can only have takeaway service. So I think you have to look at the particular kind of tier levels. You'd have to look at what the guidance is for hospitality venues. The challenge for us as churches, I suspect that for many of us, the issue is coffee and other things like refreshments at carol services. The challenge there is complying with social distancing requirements as people are served and making sure that you observe the hygiene requirements in relation to food. And of course, the serving of food and coffee and things like that is only likely to increase the fact that people are going to mingle and mix, which is what you're supposed to be preventing. So I think there are challenges, certainly within an indoor context, of providing refreshments in a way that complies with the social distancing requirements and ensures that people don't mingle.
And check the hospitality guidelines, I guess, as well, is all part of that. Yeah, excellent. John, that's all the ones for you, brother.
Thank you very much indeed. Hope sort of the Lord blesses you and watches over you through the rest of this week. I will be advocating on your behalf with the government for the next hour or so, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Go well with the Minister for Faith, John.